a barrage of information, and then you're telling us to read other books, and some of them aren't even in English, and it's a little overwhelming, right? What always helps me, because I've been studying world religions and cults and sects and so on for like 30 years, it always helps me to get to core ideas. What is central? And you know the story about when I took a group and we toured a mosque in Chicago, and I had a chance to ask the imam, and I centered in, and you referred to it in your talk, but I centered in on Jesus. And what he had just given a talk to us, a group of Christians from a church, and said, you know, God is not divided, God does not have a son, Jesus never claimed to be the Son of God, he didn't die on the cross, and of course, therefore, no resurrection. And it helped me, and maybe you can speak to this, it helps me when I talk to a Muslim to think, I'm not going to know the whole history of Muhammad and all the variations on the Quran and all these details, but they make very specific claims that contradict the historical record of Jesus, who repeatedly claimed to be the Son of God, who, it's well attested in history, died on the cross, and then all kinds of overwhelming evidence that you've both written about, and I have too, on the evidence for the resurrection. Just speak for a minute about how centering on that issue can help all of us.
Yeah, thanks for that. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 that if Jesus is not risen, our faith is in vain, and we are of all people most to be pitied. What is he saying? He's saying that there's reason to believe in Christianity, and that reason is falsifiable. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, our faith is in vain. So take a look at history and see if there's good reason to believe Jesus rose from the dead. Now, I said this briefly before, but now I have an opportunity to expound upon it. There is no good historical explanation for what happened to Jesus except that he rose from the dead. I saw that as a Muslim. And even today when I have conversations, again, I had a conversation just the other day at Oxford with a brilliant young mind. And I said to him, this is the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. What do you think? He says, well, I don't have to make a conclusion. And I said, you're right, you don't. But if you do, the only good one is that Jesus rose from the dead. It's the only way you can get out of it. If you say, well, Jesus didn't survive crucifixion, bad conclusion. Yeah. That Jesus survived, that's a bad conclusion. So, no matter who you talk to, if you talk to a Hindu, if you talk to a Jew, if you talk to a Muslim, if you talk to an agnostic or an atheist, if you focus on the resurrection, which, by the way, is what the disciples preached from the very beginning, this man Jesus is risen from the dead, repent and be baptized for the forgiveness of sins, first sermon ever given by Peter. If you take a look at what the disciples emphasized, it was that Jesus rose from the dead, and that's the reason we can have confidence in our faith, and that works with anyone across the board.
And here's what with this imam in the mosque when I was, again, in Chicago, I asked him, I said, you're making these claims, Jesus wasn't the Son of God, didn't die on the cross, didn't raise from the dead. I know you believe that, and I know it's based on what you believe Muhammad was revealed, you know, in a cave 600 years after the time of Christ. My question to you is, do you have any historical evidence for that? And he just glared at me, and then he said, I choose to believe the prophet. In other words, it didn't seem like he had any historical reasons, but rather kind of what I would say is a leap of faith, just trusting a guy in a cave 600 years later who says an angel said it ain't so.
And I want to emphasize this for you. Some of you might be thinking, Nabil, these are Arabic terms. I don't have time to memorize all this. I don't have time to study the Quran and all that. I'll tell you, David clearly doesn't really know what he's talking about. I'm saying that tongue-in-cheek. He has learned a lot, but when we started talking, he didn't know much of anything about Islam. He didn't. What he knew was why he was a Christian. And he was willing to talk about that with me, and he was willing to learn what I had to say. So it was the willingness that you need. Have the reason for the faith that lies within you, biblical mandate, and be willing to discuss with your Muslim friends, and that will be enough. Don't think you have to be a scholar to talk to people. You don't.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And again, I think focusing on the core issue of Jesus, his identity, the historical truth of his claims and the resurrection, I think can help any of us really engage at a meaningful level on the central issue with Muslim folks.
You want to get a quick Twitter question? We're running out of time, but with a Muslim friend, when would you want to begin calling into question the authority or accuracy of the Quran?
My suggestion to people who are talking to Muslim friends is to talk about Jesus. You don't believe in the gospel because the Quran is false. You believe in the gospel because Jesus is Lord and has risen from the dead. So share Jesus. Now, when the Quran comes up, be willing to talk about the Quran. So if it never comes up in conversation, and by the way, for many people, for many Muslims, they're cultural Muslims. They've never read the Quran before at all, many Muslims. Not like our family read the Quran every day, but some people that's the case. So why would you talk about the Quran for them? They don't really care. So make sure you talk about what's on their heart, and ultimately if they do defer to the Quran, then be gracious and say, look, if what you're saying about the Quran is true, then you're right, but I don't think it's true. Let's discuss it. And then look into that information together when the time comes. But I would say always start off talking about Jesus.
Yeah, that's good. All right, over here.
Hi. I love the work you guys do at RZIM. That's wonderful stuff. Quick question. In today's society, our church society, where we talk a lot about small groups and neighborhood groups, and my question is, how do you engage Muslims that come from a totally different background as far as how they do things? How do you engage them one-on-one so that you can then invite them to come to church? How do you make that the guy that lives down the street from me? How do you do that?
That's a great question. I think the first thing you should do is say hi. And then you say, hey, I live down the street from you. Do you live here? How long have you lived here? What do you do? Just strike up a conversation. The people are people at the end of the day. They want to be loved. They want to be known. And at first, some people find it weird. Why are you talking to me? That's a natural reaction. But if you can show people you actually care about them, true love is so rare in this world. And I honestly believe that it is a result of what Jesus has done. And so invite them over to your house. There are books you can, if you're afraid about inviting Muslims to your house, there are books you can read on what to do about that. And one of them is Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, Find a Bill Correct. But just invite people over, go to their house, live life together. That's what I did with David. He'd have me over at his dad's house for beef jerky. I'd have him over at my mom's house for korma and for tandoori chicken. I think he got the better end of the deal on that one. But just live life together. And in the course of that, these discussions will arise, and then you can invite him ultimately to church. He might invite you to the mosque. And I would say don't be afraid to go as long as people know that you're not there to become Muslim. You're there to represent Christ. So live life together, which is what Jesus did. Again, let's use Jesus as our model. In Mark chapter 2, from the very beginning, people are saying, what is he doing? Why is he eating dinner with these sinners and tax collectors? It's because he's living life with those who need it. It is not the healthy who need a doctor, it is those who are sick. So live life out there with your Muslim friends, and ultimately these opportunities will arise.
And how long did David befriend you? How long was this conversation before you ultimately came to Christ?
It was over 4 years before I became a believer.
Yeah. And one more piggyback on that is, in a lot of Islamic families and culture, hospitality is a huge deal.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
And yet, I remember a statistic, I don't remember the exact number, but the majority of international students that are ever in the United States never get invited into an American household at all.
Absolutely.
And so the opportunity is just through the roof. I think of Thanksgiving coming. Why not invite some folks that are maybe exchange students or visiting from another place who are Muslim background?
Just to make the point, there was a student who was at Richmond, Virginia, and from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, by the way, is funding students to come to the United States to learn. So it's a closed country where you can't preach the gospel, and they're sending their kids here. What do you think we should do when they get here? These students, this one student in particular, brought 2 suitcases full of gifts to give to those people who invited him into their homes. Because you invite me into your home, I want to give you a gift. He brought 2 suitcases full. He went back at the end of the year, both suitcases still full. No one had invited him. What do you think that tells them about Christianity? And it's such an open door to share the gospel.
So what you said earlier, let go of fear. And you're going to have wonderful conversations and meals and friendships with people who in many cases are like you, so open to talk about truth.
And Thanksgiving raises a question, who are we thanking? And, just have a relationship, have a discussion, have a conversation. Why do they believe what they believe, and why you believe what you believe? We've had friends over, remember our Muslim friend, and had over to my house. We grilled steaks in the backyard, and nobody pulled knives on each other. We had a wonderful conversation about faith and
That's
about
so
Jesus, and it was terrific.
I remember in 7th grade, it was election time, kind of like it is now, and I asked my 7th grade civics teacher, who are you going to vote for? She looked at me like, you can't ask me that. I'm like, really? All we talk about in our family is politics and religion. I mean, what's wrong with asking the question? And that's the way it is in the Middle East. If you go there, they talk about what they're passionate about. And so if you're not talking about Christ, they assume you're not passionate about him.
Wow. One more from here, and I think we're going to have to take maybe one more.
Yeah, I think
here.
we're running out. Let's do the live question.
Yeah, okay. Come on. Maybe take a couple here, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you guys for coming. I think you guys are real cool. It's funny you just brought up that situation with the exchange student from Saudi Arabia. I was presented with this question from an exchange student from Saudi Arabia. Awesome guy. He brought up John 14:28, which says, "You've heard me say," is Jesus talking, "I'm going away and I'm coming back to you. If you love me, you'd be glad that I'm going to the Father, for the Father is greater than I." And I know that, I'm not reading the whole context of it, but how would you answer that question when trying to address that whole Trinity relationship? Jesus is saying the Father's greater than I. Is he God? Is he greater? What's going on there?
Great question. Muslims will often refer to that verse in John 14, the Father is greater than I. And they'll say, obviously, Jesus is not God. And I will say, well, let's look at that in context. Of course, we can go to the greater context of the Gospel of John. Again, the bookends, John 1:1 through 1:18, the prologue of John's Gospel clearly propounds the deity of Jesus. That's what it's all about. And then in verse 18, if you have a good translation of the New Testament, it will say, Jesus is the only begotten God. And the other end of the bookends is John 20:28, when Thomas says, Kuriasmu katheosmu, my Lord and my God. He calls Jesus God. So that's John's Gospel. Bookends, calling Jesus God. But John 14 in specific, if you look at John 14 verses 13 and 14, what does it say? It says, pray in my name, and whatever you ask, I shall give it to you. He's talking about being with the Father and being able to give people whatever they ask for in his name. So what is he saying? He's saying, I am omnipotent because I can give you whatever you ask. He's saying, I'm omnipresent because he's with the Father, but he can also be with you. Because he says he'll also come and dwell with you. And then he can also hear you. So he's what's the last one? Omniscient. So he's omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent in John chapter 14. So you look at the broader context of that verse, you can't possibly say that Jesus is denying to be God. So point out context. Whenever someone asks about a biblical verse, say that is a great question. Let's read what the Bible says. And take a look at that whole chapter. There's no way someone can read that chapter, see what Jesus says, and walk away saying Jesus is anything but God.
There's also a chapter in my book, The Case for Christ, an interview with theologian D.A. Carson that addresses that as well in depth.
Yeah, I think what he's saying is in position, in his incarnate state, his position was not equal to the Father.
Yeah, and so that's kind of the point here. For example, if you take a look at my family, my father is greater than I am in my family. He's my father. He's the leader of our family, so he's greater than I am in role. But my father is just as human as I am. So we're equal in substance, but my father is greater in role than me. So when Jesus says that the Father is greater than I, he's talking about the Father's role. He's not talking about his substance. He's equal in substance. And so we need to explain that. The term Son of God throws Muslims off. So explain the Trinity, explain that, know it yourself to be able to explain it.
We're going to take one more question. We have a couple important last things we want to do here. So go ahead.
Okay,
Thanks everyone who was waiting. Sorry.
So if the imam is their spiritual leader and the imam goes off message and they feel they don't agree with him, what latitude do they have to find another imam? Or is that possible?
Yeah, so in the Muslim world, generally speaking, certain imams, muftis, they give legal decisions, and you're supposed to stay with your mufti. But I remember seeing that some muftis were complaining about people. The legal decision is called a fatwa, by the way. A fatwa isn't just a command to kill, it's any legal decision. So I remember seeing some muftis complaining about people who were fatwa shopping. They'd go to one mufti and the mufti didn't say what they liked, so they'd go to another one.
That never happens in Christianity, by the way.
Yeah. So sometimes Muslims will go to different denominations, different sects. That's beginning to happen more and more, especially now that people have access to the internet and they can see what different people are saying. But generally speaking, if somebody says something they disagree with, they don't really just go somewhere else. They just kind of let that be. They just, okay, fine. And they'll either ignore it, they just won't talk about it, and they won't necessarily follow that through. By the way, that happens with us too. When our pastors say something we disagree with, sometimes we don't necessarily go to another church all of a sudden. We just say, well, we're going to let that be. So I hope that answers your question.
I just wanted to know if they were bound to have to follow that imam, you know.
Not really.
Okay.
No, not in any real sense, no. Socially, maybe, because their whole family is going there and all their friends are there, so that socially in that sense, maybe, but not in any theologically strict sense, no.
Thank you. Thanks for the great questions. I have a question for Lee, I have a question for Nabil, and then I'm going to pray, and then we'll be done, okay? My question for you, Lee, I mentioned it earlier. I know the case for grace was, in many ways, probably the hardest thing you've ever done. And I know you went through a